Hello students, this is Matheus Santos from the University of South Florida, and today I will describe to you our new study, How October 7, 2023 Changed Fear and Hate Against Jewish Members of Universities, which is a collaboration with my colleague Declaio Gaff from the University of Toronto. So on October 7, Hamas made that huge terrorist attack against Israel with more than 1,000 victims, which was followed by an ongoing occupation in Gaza by Israel with many thousands of victims. And in the aftermath of that entire event, there is a report of an increase in hate against Jewish individuals around the world, including within universities, irrespective of these individuals' involvement with the conflict in the Middle East. In our study, we were trying to find a way to systematically measure that entire phenomenon, right? Essentially, to measure the prevalence of hate and fear amongst Jewish members of universities globally with an international perspective, and to estimate what was the impact of October 7 on those prevalences. So ideally, what you would want for a study like that is a pre and post measures of your outcomes, right? I would want to have done a survey before October 7 and a second survey after October 7. And of course, we would love to do that, but we failed to go back in time. As hard as we tried, we could not do just that. And the main idea people have, the more natural idea, the simpler idea, is to simply ask people, hey, how has your life changed since October 7? Do you feel more afraid today than you did before October 7? That design is interesting, is great. There's nothing wrong with it. There is another study which has done something similar to that. But that design is subject to all kinds of biases, right? Including social desirability bias, right? We have a tendency to give an answer, oh, it got much worse, depending on what our goals are, our self-opinions are. Omitted variable bias, right? How your perceptions changed are related to many factors about you. Recall bias, the fact that your current perceptions are in fact, the fact that your past perceptions are very much impacted by your current situation, right? And we were trying to avoid all those biases, and we came to an imperfect solution, which was, and it's imperfect for many reasons, of course, which was to conduct a survey experiment in which we randomly assigned period. All right, so you would ask people a lot of outcomes, and we would ask them, all right, so how do you feel about those things in the weeks before October 7, right? And that was one random manipulation, the weeks before October 7. And to another person, we would ask those same exact questions, but we would ask those questions about the weeks after October 7. And finally, to a third person, we would ask about recent weeks. And we randomly assign those manipulations in period, whether we would ask you about the weeks before, the weeks after, or about recent weeks. And because this timing was assigned at random, our estimates are not subject to omitted variable bias. And because the respondents were not aware of our study's design, estimates are also less sensitive to social desirability bias, because our estimates are in fact the difference between the before and the after, right? Whether it actually changed between before and after. So in a way, our estimates are more conservative, which we felt was good. Of course, that's not a perfect solution. It has many flaws that we discuss at length. And ultimately, we end up with this great sample of 201 Jewish members of universities in North America and in Europe. And the most important part of that sample, we were very afraid of the survey getting leaked, was that we wanted the sample to be verified. That's the most critical part of online surveys, is that your sample is verified. So we collected our data through this partnership with these major academic Jewish organizations, which are very organized, which have these huge memberships. And we collected data about over 30 outcomes about exposure and fear. And we kept our survey open through a very short amount of time, because we knew that any event that happened during the war could impact our estimates. So we kept it opening during December, which we knew was like a low activity time, and 2 weeks, in fact, only 2 weeks, to avoid period effects and to avoid leaks, right? To avoid our survey getting in the hands of people who would try to defraud the answers and so on and so forth. So we spent a lot of time validating and verifying our responses. So first, in regards to exposure, I just selected a few outcomes over here. And what we have here is that even before, the blue bar is before October 7, the orange bar is the exposure after October 7, and finally the gray bar is in recent weeks. And what you see is that hate speech against Jewish person was already very, very prevalent in the weeks before October 7, right? 36% of our respondents reported, self-report, that they were exposed to that before October 7. However, after October 7, that greatly increased to 54%, and in recent weeks, it increased even more. And we see similar patterns to graffiti displaying Nazi or other anti-Semitic symbols, like it increased from 36%, roughly, near the same proportion, to 45.9%. So about half of the respondents were exposed to that. Doxing on social media, people being exposed on social media, went up from 15%, a low prevalence, to over 37%. A lot of dehumanization against Jewish persons, a lot of dehumanizations of Israelis in particular. And the main outcome is the public protests against Israel, anti-Israel public protests, which really increased from just 27% before to 78 to 80%, which is understandable in the context of Israel's reaction. So in regards to victimization, what we see is that fortunately there is not that much in terms of physical assault, right? About 8 respondents were reported to be physically assaulted on campus and outside of campus as well. That prevalence is high. That's not a low number to any extent, right? Though in that case, our sample size, unfortunately, is too small given how rare the event is. But it is an event that it doesn't occur all that often. It didn't change all that much. But what we see instead is a lot of verbal harassment. And an interesting feature of the verbal harassment on campus and outside of campus is that it was already high before, and it didn't increase all that much after. It increased a little bit, and then it went down again in the case of verbal harassment on campus, but it was already quite high before, right? About 1/5 of our respondents reported being victims of verbal harassment on campus in the weeks before October 7. Think about yourself. How often are you a victim of verbal harassment on campus? Myself, never, probably. And we also measure whether that impact our respondents' comfort level, right? So we had a measure which ranged from very uncomfortable to neutral to comfortable and to very comfortable, right? And this is the average of all of our respondents. And what you see is that the blue line is nearly always positive, strongly positive in the weeks before October 7. And in the weeks after, either it became very close to zero or it became negative. So for simple daily activities like leaving their homes or traveling by plane, now they're feeling kind of neutral about it, right? And this is a huge effect, right? It went from roughly between comfortable to very comfortable to neutral, right? They no longer feel comfortable leaving their homes or traveling by plane. They feel very uncomfortable engaging in social media, which is where most of the heated discussion happens. And mostly they feel uncomfortable expressing their religious affiliation or expressing their race and ethnicity. And in terms of on campus, they no longer feel as comfortable attending class, walking around on campus, attending Jewish events. They feel uncomfortable expressing their religious belief, expressing their connection to Israel, speaking Hebrew where someone else can hear, and wearing a kippah. So we see these huge impacts on daily, everyday activities that are now, people no longer feel necessarily comfortable doing them. And our respondents are primarily uncomfortable expressing their culture, showing to other people who they are. So in fact, what's happening is that they're being forced to hide their identity, their group identity, which is very sad in a way, because in a way that may explain why they're not being victimized more. It's because they're being more discreet. And we discuss all of that in the context of the paper, right? So in conclusion, we found essentially through this, it's a research note, it's a small study, and that antagonism was already very high before October 7, but it got much worse, right, after October 7. And now it's directly impacting comfort level. And the comfort level for conducting daily activities, and particularly for our respondents for expressing their culture as Jewish individuals. Somehow, Jewish persons are being harmed for something that's completely outside of their control, right? They are not the Israeli government, and even if they were, regardless of whatever attitude they have about it, they have the right to have that attitude, right? But they're being punished and sanctioned, or more generally harmed, irrespective of their attitudes or behavior, irrespective of what they're doing. And that feels somehow to many people normal, right? Even the reaction I get to this paper from a lot of people is, oh, okay, that's fine, but look at what Israel is doing. And what I respond often, okay, yes, Israel is doing that, but not themselves. And as a Brazilian national, I was never personally blamed for anything my government did, and I assume most of us. So that feels strange, and there is this question like, why amongst Jewish persons that is feeling normal for many people in our society, right? And that may go back to the idea of a model minority. It may go back to that idea of this very strong cultural group that is very much tied up to the Israeli government, and there may be a lot more there than we actually try to discuss in the paper. And more generally, we make an argument that, and it's a very old debate. It dates back to Illuminism and before, that free speech requires tolerance and safety. If you don't feel safe, you're not going to say anything, right? If you don't feel like your ideas are being tolerated, you're going to keep yourself quiet, and there's not real free speech. There's just harassment and there's just intimidation, right? And we, especially in the context of a university, we can disagree profoundly without make each other feel threatened, right? It's not a matter of what our ideas are. It's a matter of how we convey them and how respectful we are towards people who disagree with us. And we should try to be more tolerant and more flexible. And I am sure we can do that, particularly given where we are. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please reach out. It was a pleasure. Huh? See you around.